Kyoto Agreement was ratified by 45 countries, while Paris by 197. We agree with the affirmative team that compliance is important, but when numbers are there is such a big difference in numbers, we think that participation and the amount of countries which sign is also something which should not be neglected. What am I going to do in my speech are a few things. So first of all, clarify what this debate is about, because there was general misconception of how two teams debate this one, and then we'll look into two areas of clash. I will talk about which side has better participation, and secondly, which side has better compliance, later on comparing the two worlds. Let's start with clarity. I would like to emphasize, first of all, what are the burdens of proof in this debate. Both sides need to prove what are the exclusive benefits of both agreements. So proposition have to show why binding agreements are good, and we have to show why non-binding ones. That is to say, the argument about that we need positive enforcement mechanisms is not sufficient in this debate, because simply even Paris Agreement or non-binding accords have these measures as well. Hence, this is what the debate should be primarily about. That is to say, next thing is about criteria of this debate. We think that this debate, for you to be judged, is about the trade-off between compliance and participation. Because generally, in binding accords, there is lower rate of participation because countries are deterrent, while we agree and take on the burden of the fact that having non-binding agreements means that there is lower rate of compliance. We have to compare these two, and this is the reason why we believe we should win the debate. Let's start with participation as such. We talked about two things in our first speech. That is to say, sovereignty and impact on the economy. We explained how it's important to recognize the severity of the status quo. That is to say, rise of nationalist movements such as Brexit and all around the world. And the second argument was about the economy. And here it is really important to understand that what the second speaker of the proposition explained wasn't sufficient to this debate. Because they talked about, climate change is important, but economy is less than it. Academically, that's completely correct. But that's not how people perceive agreements. That is not how people perceive sovereignty. People in the world, or average Joe, simply cares about the fact if his country is dependent on others or not. That's the reason why in most European countries, and even in Slovakia, we simply see a rise of populist movements. With that, we need to elaborate. So there are three reasons why we win on participation. First of all, because we explicitly explained that the United States and China will simply never ratify any binding agreement. They said that the United States Senate has to ratify these agreements, and they explicitly said that this is not the case. Why? Let's analyze it more deeply. Because simply, you want to tackle climate change, but you don't want to do that by looking as a vulnerable person who is willing to agree to commitments of other individuals. That is to say, we believe that countries are willing to fight against climate change, but not when they are forced to do something. They need to have voluntary measures, which we think is something on our side of the house. Second thing, we also see it is pretty weird that team opposition completely neglected all our evidence. We talked about how Basel Convention had over 100 parties, but later when adopting the ban amendment, which was binding, the participation dropped by half. We also talked about the Montreal Protocol, which was yes, shortly binding, but when adopting a really harsh Kigali amendment, simply again decreased to only 30-something parties. We can see that these are numbers which are significant in this debate. It's not like one or two countries. That is to say, participation falls on our side. The affirmative tried to draw your eyes into the compliance. So let me deal with that as well. Compliance. We see that compliance works on our side as well. They talked about international pressure. They talked about how there is domestic pressure by communities. But this is, again, something we have on our side as well. If people care about climate change, they will push it no matter if it's binding agreement or a non-binding one, right? This is the reason why we use the evidence of Chicago Amendment after Donald Trump withdrew from Paris Agreement, because we can simply see that even in non-binding accords where people leave, we have domestic and civil society who pushes these countries to do something. Hence, there is not a big marginal difference between the two worlds. Now, affirmative try to actually say that the unique benefits of theirs is the issue of sanctions. There are three reasons why sanctions are simply a bad mechanism as such. First, when big countries leave, no one can do anything. So China and the United States left from Kyoto Agreement when it adopted the binding enforcement. And guess what? No one did anything because no one is able and willing to impose sanctions on these big players. Secondly, we talked about how it's problematic on free trade blocks areas. So Slovakia and other countries which have populist people, they simply do you think that it's proper to punish the whole European Union for a mistake of one country? We think that this is generally immoral as such. With that, we're able to show why generally on our side of the house we even have sufficient level of compliance compared to participation. Lastly, let's compare these two trade-offs, because we think that in our side of the house we not only have better participation, but also why participation is better. Because with more countries participating, we have media coverage. We have more people more media who talk about more countries being there. But even on top of that, agreements such as Paris Agreement don't have a negative media influence because they don't infringe on sovereignty of people. That is to say, people know that climate change is important and good to fighting against it only when there is non-binding. For all these reasons, don't forget that participation is something we need to uphold.